cloud. Okay, there we are. Thank you. Okay, Roger.
Okay, well, tonight we have sort of a bonus because Carm originally asked Carissa Brown to give a talk, but we get 2 for 1 tonight because we also got Heather Baehre. And so this is great. Carissa is a member of the geography department. She's a couple of doors down the hallway from me. And she's a specialist in boreal forest systems. And she especially likes to look at them near their limits because that's where they are sort of under stress and do interesting things, I guess. And one of the things her research has showed is that things aren't nearly as simple as you might expect. The adaptation to climate change is not so simple as going up the mountainside or going a little further north. There are all sorts of complicated interactions that make that not so simple or easy or maybe impossible. And this research is not only interesting, it's important. And as breaking news tonight, she's just been awarded the President's Award for Outstanding Research. So congratulations, Carissa, for that. Heather Baehre has just finished her master's degree with Carissa, and her field work was in the Hawk Hills, which is, I guess, what she'll be talking about tonight, and looking especially at sort of Arctic and alpine plants that are found there, like diapensia. She's currently working with the DFO as a fish habitat protections program specialist, and I hope one of the things we learn from her tonight is how studying diapensia in the Hawk Hills is a great preparation for working in fish habitats. So I guess we should just let them talk about these things because I'm eager to hear about it and see their pictures.
Thank you, Roger. None of us know if Roger's retired or not.
If you find out, let me know.
He strolls in every once in a while and then stays up to the wee hours down in his office writing grants and books and things. So to be determined. Thank you very much for the invitation to all of you at the Wildflower Society and to Roger for the introduction. It was really a pleasure to be invited again. I gave a talk a few years ago on black spruce and fire. If folks were around, it was in person at the Botanical Gardens way back when. And I really enjoyed it. I really enjoy speaking to you all and to this community. So when I was asked to give this talk about Hawk Hills and diapensia, I thought that was a great topic and a great idea. And I also thought immediately, I am not the person to be giving that talk. It is Heather in our group in the Northern Edge Lab who absolutely is the driving force behind this research. And so I was really excited that she indeed agreed to give the talk with me, since she will do it the most justice. I'm going to start by introducing barrens more generally and talking a little bit about what barrens are and how plants are able to live there. But first, I'll just acknowledge that all this work that we've done here for Heather's research and also the lands that we're giving the talk on right now are the ancestral lands of the Beothuk people and the Mi'kmaq people. And so let's, Heather's controlling the slides, so we're going to see how polished we are here. So far, so good. All right, so first let's talk really just generally about why species live where they do. We know globally that climate is absolutely the first control on where species live in space, and substrate is the second driver. So climate and substrate are the two main drivers of the distribution of species, not just plant species, all species. So let's start with climate. That's the first one. If the climate in an area is outside of what a species can tolerate, if it's too hot for their body systems to work, if it's too cold and they freeze and they don't have adaptations for freezing, it doesn't matter how good the substrate is, it doesn't matter how good the soil is, they're absolutely not going to be able to survive there. So climate is kind of the first thing that filters species out of an area. If the climate is good enough, if a species can tolerate the climate in a spot, then the next driver is substrate. So what substrate is, it's just really the stuff that species live in. So it's a little complicated for humans. We're very good at altering our substrate, but let's talk about, how about a humpback whale? Its substrate is the ocean water. For a rainbow trout, its substrate is freshwater, same with a water lily. For an air plant, it's the air and the canopy of the rainforest. For most terrestrial plants, it's the soil that they're living in. That's the substrate for most terrestrial plants. And substrate can have all different characteristics having to do with how coarse it is or how fine the soil is, if it's very sandy, if it's very clay dominated. That's going to determine how much water it can hold or how quickly it dries out. Soil also has specific chemistry depending on what the rock type is underneath, depending on all the other processes happening around it. All of those things also influence how many nutrients are available. So let's zoom into plants. Once a plant is living in a climate it can tolerate, it then needs to find, it then will only occur on a substrate it can tolerate. Sorry, Heather, I forgot to write the word click on this one. There we go. Thank you for anticipating that. All right, so now let's talk about what barrens are. Now that I've set the scene of climate and substrate are the primary controls on where species can exist in the world. So if climate and substrate are the two main drivers of the distribution of species, let's imagine that we're standing in this landscape. And let's say that it's summer. And so we're wearing shorts and a t-shirt and flip-flops. So let's now pretend that maybe we're tourists and we didn't really know much about Newfoundland. We're standing out in this landscape, ready to enjoy the summer, ready to have a nice tour of this area. And just take a look at this picture and think about what kind of climate you're experiencing. Regardless of where on Earth this is, and some of you might be very familiar with this picture or this spot on Earth already, you can kind of imagine, if you just gaze at this picture for a bit, that it doesn't look that comfortable there, and you might get a little bit of a chill down your spine just looking at the picture, or perhaps you might imagine a bit of a blasting gale hitting your summer outfit. But you persist. You think, I can tolerate this climate. I'm here, I'm on an adventure, I can do this. And so you start to walk across this landscape in your flip-flops because it's summer, and why wouldn't you be wearing flip-flops? And then you see, wow, this is a really challenging surface to navigate. It's hard, it's slippery, there's not very much to grab onto. You start to question your life choices that you've made on this day, having to do with the clothes you're wearing and the footwear you're wearing. And this, folks, is what it's like to live on the Barrens. So barrens, in definition, are described as something that is devoid of life, a place that produces little vegetation, that's desolate, that is lacking interest or charm. Now, I think that's getting a little bit personal, perhaps a little bit rude to the Barrens. And Heather and I are here today to really challenge this notion of the definition of Barrens, I suppose. We're certainly hoping to charm you or demonstrate their charms by the end of our talk. But I think taking those definitions, that kind of scenario I described to you, I think we can describe barrens as a very stressful environment. And it is one where those two main drivers of species distributions, climate and substrate, are very challenging for plant life. If we're going to switch that to kind of evolution speak, we would say that it's a very strong selective pressure on the species that are occurring there. So it's just a really stressful place to live. And let's imagine back to our scenario here that you're there in your summer clothes, standing out on this barrens. You are very likely to make a smart life decision given your suitability for this landscape, and you're probably going to leave. That is one of three ways that a species can react to a stressful environment. species can either move, they can adapt, or they can die. That was very dramatic. For plants, that means that propagules, like seeds, can disperse out of the stressful environment. Imagine that they're just always dispersing out. And then if it's stressful, that dispersal is maybe more important for the species to continue to live. So they can move by dispersing out of the environment and establishing elsewhere. They can adapt to the stress through generations over time, or they can die. So you chose to move out of that environment in your shorts and flip-flops by leaving, but you also could have chosen to adapt by putting on proper clothes. And I don't think that we should continue the thought experiment with our third option there. So let's talk about adapting. That's what we're exploring today, is what are these adaptations that allow life to persist on the barrens? Because contrary to our definition of barrens as lifeless places, barrens are full of life, unique, beautiful, rugged, weird little life that can withstand those really strong climatic and really challenging substrate conditions. And they're able to grow, they're able to reproduce, and they're able to persist. And here's a few examples here to barrens that are consistent globally. Oh, there we go, sorry. These are examples from places as far separated as on the right. Oh, I forgot to label it. I'm pretty sure that's Androsachie in the Yukon. And then the two on the left are in New Zealand alpine barrens. So some adaptations to barrens are consistent globally, really compact growth forms with densely packed structures. So not only are the leaves kind of close to the ground and dense, there's a lot of really dense branching, and the flowers are also densely packed. And even though these can be really kind of stark, desolate looking places from afar, when you come close to them, they have some of the most absolutely gorgeous flowers that you can find in some landscapes. So this kind of cushion plant form can be found in alpine tundra in North Yukon, like I mentioned, to high altitude sites in New Zealand, in many places in between, and of course on the island of Newfoundland. So I'll just take us on a quick tour of some of the examples of barrens across the island. And of course, there's also barrens in Labrador and Nunatsiavut, but those are of two types. Just really coarsely, we have coastal barrens there as well as kind of Arctic alpine barrens. So here on the island, I think many folks are likely familiar with the hyperoceanic barrens in places like Cape St. Mary's and elsewhere, shown on the ecoregions map in light purple. Oh, excellent mouse work, Heather, thank you. So these are areas that are very foggy, very mild winters, very, very, very foggy. Fog is definitely a driving force here, and lots of things like blanket bogs and heath. So those are maybe more famous with the birding folks, but I suspect most folks here are quite familiar with the floristically famous barrens on the island, the limestone barrens, which is the photo that I showed earlier. Don't wear your flip-flops and shorts and a t-shirt. This is definitely more rugged weather and landscapes for walking across. So the limestone barrens of the Great Northern Peninsula are in the Strait of Belle Isle ecoregion. And I'm sure that many of you know Louise Hermanouts really well and have heard her speak on these barrens. She's long dedicated her efforts to understanding them and to restoring their floristic communities, including our only endemic plants on the island, which include 2 Brea species and a willow. So some folks here may have also had the pleasure of visiting the long-range mountains barrens on the west coast of the island. And these areas have some of our longest snow cover and have really typical alpine heath vegetation. There's also spots there and in a couple of other places on the island that have barrens adapted to serpentine soils. And those serpentine soils have a really unique chemistry that's very challenging for plants. They have a lot of trouble taking up the nutrients, especially nitrogen, that they need for their life processes based on the heavy metals found in serpentine soils. So those kinds of barrens are found in the Bloamy Downs, the Tablelands in Grossmorn, and the White Hills south of St. Anthony. So one last example, which I hope that you all have been to, and although we do have we have an international crowd tonight, but I feel like everyone has come here to Newfoundland if you're joining into these talks, the Maritime Barrens. And the Maritime Barrens are found on most of our eastern peninsulas on the island. It's the green on the map, the Avalon, and as well as the Burin and the South Coast. Here, a lot of these barrens are driven by fire. Not all of them, but a lot of the barrens, especially right around the coastal regions, are actually the result of European colonization and burning for settlement. And so burning for clearing land for agriculture is a really common practice in regions of Europe, in the last few centuries. And when European colonization happened here, burning to clear land to settle had a little bit of a different effect given the amount of soil or the lack of soil that we have here around the Avalon and the Bonavista and other peninsulas. So these are the barrens that we're going to delve more deeply into today. And this is really going to be our attempt to refute that claim that barrens are desolate, empty, and devoid of life. So we want to take you to the secret world of the barrens, where the closer you look, the more life you find. And to take us there now, I'm going to pass us over to the diapensia ecology expert, Heather, who's going to tell us how we did our research in the barrens. And thank you for the excellent clicking assistantship there, Heather.
You're very welcome. Hi, everyone. Thank you again from myself for inviting us to share about the secret world of diapensia and the Newfoundland Barrens. My name is Heather, and I've spent the last few years researching this mysterious diapensia, although for many of you it may not be so mysterious, but it was for my Master of Science at Lund. So I'm going to be chatting a bit about my research, but hopefully not get too into the weeds, pun intended, I suppose. And then I'll show you some interesting field observations, pictures that I'm sure you fellow plant enthusiasts will enjoy very much. What is diapensia? Well, it is a dwarf cushion-forming plant, and its common name is the pincushion plant. This is a picture here that I took from my fieldwork. And it's adapted to very harsh Arctic alpine environments. And it can be found in a number of different environments across North America, particularly in coastal, barren Arctic and alpine regions. However, there are actually two morphologically, so their growth forms are slightly different between the two species, or between the species in North America. So there's a population in Western North America, and then there's also a subspecies population in Eastern North America. And the one that we're going to focus on today in Newfoundland and Labrador is the latter, so the Eastern North America. A lot of these locations can be outlined in this map produced by Day and Scott, who studied diapensia on the island during the 80s. And some of you may even be familiar with some of their work. So I just wanted to share that. All right, so a little diving a bit deeper. So it's densely packed, small, oblong, leathery leaves. You can kind of get a really good idea in this picture on the right. Are ideal for protecting the cushion of inner dead leaf material, which you can kind of see this dead leaf material here. And it's important in this cushion, this dead leaf material is important for trapping moisture and nutrients and regulating the temperature inside the cushion. So during the spring and summer months, the leaves are a shade of bright green, like you can see in the picture on the left. And in the fall and winter months, they turn this dark, deep burgundy color due to the high levels of anthocyanins. And the color change has been suggested to improve the ability to absorb heat, which is why they would change color in the fall and winter, or in the colder months. And generally, they flower between May and June in most places, but there are actually several notable locations on the island of Newfoundland that have actually seen a blooming period in June and late August, which is really interesting and quite unique. All right, so the populations of diapensia on the Avalon are interesting because they are neither at high elevations or in Arctic regions, and are towards the southern and eastern edges of their North American range. And therefore, I kind of wanted to better understand what allowed them to persist here. So I broke down my research questions into 3 sections. The first was kind of biotic factors, so things that might affect the biological things that might affect the persistence of the species. Abiotic factors like climate, microtopography, that kind of thing. And then I also wanted to see whether the biological factors that were affecting its persistence on the island of Newfoundland were comparable in other locations. So my first research objective was to characterize the Arctic alpine plant communities at sites with diapensia on the Avalon Peninsula. And then I also wanted to see whether its presence and how much, or like the cover of it, can be predicted by the number of different species there were around it, and how much rock there was taking up the landscape, which I can tell you is a lot, as I'm sure most of you know. My third objective was to understand the abiotic factors. So like I mentioned, microtopography, so the change in landscape over a relatively small area, and microclimate that allow diapensia to persist on the Avalon. And then finally, my fourth one, like I mentioned, was to compare the plant communities associated with diapensia across Eastern North America to the Avalon Peninsula, to kind of determine whether these plant communities are unique. All right, so to achieve these objectives, I needed to select study sites on the Avalon. So I really used this map that I showed you earlier, because why change a good thing? If they found the sites, then I'm gonna kind of try and use that to inform my decisions on selecting a site. So from here, we selected the Avalon Peninsula, and we chose particularly Hawk Hills, which will be this one, and you'll see a picture here in a minute. And then in the Avalon Wilderness Reserve. So both are protected areas. And in addition to this map that was from previous literature, I also looked at geological and topographic maps to kind of help inform my decisions on choosing sites. All right, so this picture on the left, my first study site is Hawk Hills, which is an ecological protected area. And I have 3 of my 5 sites distributed in about a kilometer apart in the Hawk Hills. And it's dominated by barren rock and high winds, usually upward and probably above 120 kilometers an hour. And there's dense fog. And these hills are some of the highest elevations on the Avalon Peninsula, but to put it in perspective, my highest site elevation in the Hawk Hills was 280 meters above sea level. So in comparison to some other places, that's not overly high. And all of these were about 15 to 17 kilometers from the ocean, just for also some context there. My second study area was the Avalon Wilderness Reserve, so this here, which is actually a massive wilderness reserve, protected area by the provincial government. And some of it does border on the Avalon Forest, which Carissa showed in her map previously, but there are pockets of the Maritime Barrens within that. And so this area is dominated with muskeg and glacial erratics, so massive boulders and outcrops, which is where I mostly found diapensia. All right, so I'll quickly breeze through this, but my methods for assessing the biotic and abiotic factors. For the biotic factors, I looked at community composition. So I did looked at quadrats and percent cover of different species. And then from that information, I also gathered the biodiversity of plants, so the number of different plant species and rock cover, because that seemed to be a somewhat limiting factor. And then I also assessed abiotic factors like microtopography. Those were generally observational. And then microclimate was assessed by measuring the temperature of the microclimate underneath the cushion itself. All right, this graph that I'm going to show you will depict the kind of different plant communities. So what I did to understand the plant communities at the Hawk Hills and Avalon Wilderness sites was a statistical analysis that basically shows how similar or dissimilar plots are based on their community composition. So when looking at this graph, which I will reveal in a second, the small points that are close to one another are more similar to each other in terms of the plant species found, and those that are far apart are more different in terms of the plant species found. And there are some acronym labels that represent the plant species that are found most commonly, but I will kind of simplify those a little bit as well. So here's the graph. And I also did an analysis to show us the plots where diapensia was found. So this turquoise kind of circle, and the pink circle or red circle is where diapensia was not found. All right, so kind of what this graph tells us is that there are a number of higher moisture species that you guys are probably familiar with that are often found more in wetlands. So sweetgale, Labrador tea, bog laurel, leatherleaf, and those you can see, or we will see, are furthest from the sites that have diapensia, meaning that they don't often share the same natural space. This graph also tells us that species that require less moisture to survive, so alpine azalea, grasses, crowberry, are more often associated with plots having diapensia. So when you think about this, it makes sense, because generally plants prefer locations with good moisture levels because it provides an essential resource for growing. But for species like diapensia that are actually quite slow growing, rapidly colonizing species like those that are in higher moisture areas are too much to compete with, and so it kind of makes it less ideal even on barrens. And we observed these areas of increased moisture in the lower lying, more protected areas of the barren landscape, suggesting that those higher exposed locations would be more ideal for diapensia. And we continued to see this trend when we assess the plant species richness. So looking at the number of different plant species found and the amount of rock cover at my sites. So we demonstrated that diapensia prefers a specific microhabitat on the barrens, and in short, appears to be somewhat of a Goldilocks plant, we'll call it. So in areas that were almost entirely solid bedrock or heavily disturbed gravel, so kind of like this site here, which is in the Avalon Wilderness Reserve, the presence and quantity of diapensia was actually quite low. It decreased substantially. And in areas where there was a high number of different plant species, so a high species richness, the presence and quantity of diapensia also decreased. However, diapensia was found most when there was a relatively low number of different plant species and kind of a medium level amount of rock. So kind of like Goldilocks, not too rocky, but also not too full of different plant species. Not too hot, not too cold. And if we continue to think about where we see rock and vegetation co-occurring on the landscape, we should consider that microtopography as kind of another factor may aid in diapensia's existence here. So investigating this would add to our theory that diapensia would be found less in lower lying areas where resources, water, nutrients, and topsoil could be provided to faster growing plants that it couldn't compete with. So you'll see in this graph on the left that diapensia was mainly observed in vegetated mats and mounds, which I'll show you here. These aren't the best pictures, but essentially, like, we were going off of flat, basically gravel or flat rock. A crevice was below, dipped down below the flat gravel rock, and a mound was like the edges of a frost circle. Where there was some frost heave in the middle of the ground, and then a mat was just usually a layer of vegetation. But they weren't always specific to a particular cover type, so such as rock, vegetation, rock mix, or just solely vegetation. All right. And this one is really interesting because, like I mentioned, if you remember at the beginning, other cushion plants had been found to adapt to harsh climatic conditions that they may be exposed to by reducing the impacts of extreme temperatures by trapping air and moisture. And this can possibly provide a safe haven for other species to use it kind of like a nurse plant. And in the field, I often did observe other species, blueberry, for example, growing within a cushion, or partridge berry, a number of different species. But all that to say that we wanted to delve deeper into why or if the diapensia on the Avalon Peninsula were also adapting, or whether they were kind of reducing the impacts of those extreme temperatures. So we placed temperature loggers underneath exposed ground or just normal vegetation, and then also underneath the cushion itself. And we wanted to see whether there was a difference. Oops, sorry. And what we found was the average temperatures were almost identical. But in looking at the maximum and minimum temperatures, you'll see that we can see that the cushion temperature suggests a moderating effect on extreme maximum and minimum temperatures in comparison to exposed temperatures. And so that's really interesting. And I think that doing longer term studies on this would be really cool to see, especially in the as we deal with climate change. All right, and the last thing that I want to touch on quickly is that after we focused on the Avalon Peninsula populations of diapensia, we wanted to compare and contrast the plant communities in other locations in Eastern North America to see whether they were similar or if the communities on the Avalon were unique in some way. So to do this, I used iNaturalist. So yes, your observations are very helpful, and they can be used. Citizen science can be used in research. And I also used the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, or GBIF. And some of that was from the Canadian Museum of Nature herbarium data, or collections, I should say. And then I also just reached out to a bunch of different people across Nunavut, Newfoundland, New Hampshire, New York, Maine, and Vermont. Sorry. We then use the same type of statistical analysis that I showed previously that allows us to see how similar or dissimilar plots are based on their community composition. So again, when you're looking at this graph, the small points that are close to one another have more similar.
Put it up.
And those that are far apart are different in terms of the plant species found. The acronym labels on this are very small, but then I'll get to the main point, which is that the plant communities associated with the presence of diapensia across Eastern North America appear to follow a latitudinal gradient. So we see the Nunavut communities on the far left with the highest latitude, followed by the northern peninsula of Newfoundland, followed by the Avalon Peninsula, followed by Vermont, Maine, New Hampshire, and then New York. And just to finish us off here, the goal of this research was to approach diapensia from kind of a hierarchical perspective, if you will, regarding its habitat, in that we looked at the plant form itself as a habitat, as a form of habitat, followed by the local microhabitat on the Avalon that these plants coexisted with other species, and then compared this local habitat on a regional scale to better understand its range. So what did this tell us about our populations on the Avalon in terms of the whole species range? Well, in comparison to the rest of eastern North America, diapensia on the Avalon Peninsula seems to exist in the Goldilocks or middle zone of its range in terms of latitude. And although this may seem intuitive, comparing local and regional data could be really useful in terms of beginning to predict how these predominantly Arctic alpine species will react to global change. However, based on its slow-growing tendencies, and in terms of conservation, populations on the Avalon Peninsula persist in microhabitats within almost a subset of barrens, which was really well described by Carissa using that map, because the maritime barrens are a subset of all of the barrens, and within those barrens, only microhabitats have diapensia. So this makes them really vulnerable to habitat destruction by ATVing off trail and continued expansion of power line access, because the Avalon Peninsula is the most populated part of the province. Yeah. And I believe Carissa is going to finish us off briefly, and then I'll show you some cool pictures.
All right, so what does this all mean for what comes next? We know that we're undergoing global change. Newfoundland and Labrador undergoing ongoing climate change. So how might the Barrens communities here on the Avalon and those globally change as we continue to experience that climate change, or will they at all? So let's think back to our drivers of barrens and our drivers of where species can occur. Here on the Avalon, it's both harsh climate and challenging substrates that make those environments so stressful that only plants like diapensia with really compact growth forms can persist. And the harshness of that climate on our barrens here on the Avalon comes in large part, Heather and I can testify to, from exposure to very strong winds. In fact, Heather, I meant to put in the video of us trying to lay down a transect, and we honestly could barely hold on to just like a nylon transect tape in the winds on the Hawk Hills. Is incredible. So that really strong wind is stressful in itself. It's blowing moisture away from leaves. It can desiccate plants. It's blowing soil and substrate and small rocks across these barrens. Then also think about it in the winter months when we have snow scouring and ice blasting blowing across these barrens. Here on the Avalon and more broadly on the island, we expect more intense and frequent storms with climate change. So even as it gets warmer, I guess the question is, are there really other species here that can withstand those conditions? Even if the climate gets warmer, are there other species beyond our really well-adapted diapensia and other barren species that can withstand those conditions on Hawk Hills and other exposed sites? So if you've been up there, you know that it's hard to even catch your breath. And I think for now, and I'm going to put a real big asterisk on this, as long as our patches of habitat remain protected from human disturbance, as Heather just kind of hinted at, which is probably a whole separate talk or a long conversation about the impacts of ATV use on these like precious barrens plants, that diapensia and these other species are probably going to be fairly persistent, at least in the coming decades under climate change, just because the thing that maintains those barrens is that absolutely wildly overwhelming wind, and that is not going to change up there. But we also need to consider that if something unexpected does occur and conditions become easier for other species, that they're kind of laying in wait inside that protective shell of those diapensia cushions. So the stage is kind of set for species that aren't as adapted to those harsh conditions to then disperse from inside those diapensia cushions, where they're just kind of hanging out, occasionally throwing a blueberry out or some seed out, hoping to propagate in a new spot. So if we think again to those things that species can do under changing conditions, move, adapt, or die, we really hope that enough of these challenging habitats will persist so that diapensia traits are still favorable adaptations for their environments. And speaking of those traits, Heather's going to take you on a little tour of some very unique forms of diapensia that she observed during her fieldwork.
Sorry, that was a real sneak peek speed round, but I'll go through them much slower. So these are just a few things that I noticed that I thought were really interesting growth forms and physiological changes that were really cool. So this first one here, as you saw in quite a few of my pictures, this doesn't really look like the cushion plant diapensia. The leaves look similar, but the growth form itself is a lot more distributed. The leaves are distributed along a stem. And the only thing that I could think of was that it was hiding under this little, very low growing wind-stressed larch that happened to be protecting it. And it was tucked right up against the trunk of this tree that was hanging on for dear life. Yeah, I just thought that it was really interesting because it wasn't something that I'd seen before in my other field observations where diapensia was more exposed. This was also interesting. This cushion of diapensia was kind of wedged or hidden in between two large boulders. And you'll notice that these stems or these pedicels, I guess, are very elongated. And as well, the actual cushion itself is, the leaves are more dispersed and less densely packed. Again, as I'm out in the field, just thinking of why this is happening, perhaps this more loose distribution of leaves is because it's so protected, but at the same time, the flower itself, which is in this little pocket, is what will disperse the seeds. So because it's protected, it needs to get up there to hopefully get in the wind to distribute its seeds. So it's possible that, or other literature that I read, I've heard of them rising above the snowpack in the winter as well. So all potential. This is me in the field. This was a large boulder in the Avalon Wilderness Reserve, and these little guys here are all diapensia, if you would believe. They were just hanging on to any moss, lichen, deteriorated gravel that had fallen off or had accumulated in little crevices on this giant boulder, but it was just in the middle of barren landscape around it. So I thought that was pretty cool. This one, possibly one of the most interesting. So as I mentioned at the beginning, Newfoundland in particular, and especially on the Avalon, Hawk Hills is one of the locations that has blooming May, June, and also August. But these flowers, I was actually in the field in October, and which you can kind of maybe guess because of the color change in the leaves. And so I thought that was really interesting. And it wasn't the only plant. There were a couple of others that were also blooming at that time. So an interesting physiological anomaly, I guess, you might say. Another interesting physiological kind of situation is you'll notice, well, first of all, you'll notice how much shorter these pedicels are from that other picture that I showed you. But also you'll notice that this right at the base of the flower, the leaves have changed color to be, it's more dark, deep burgundy, whereas the rest of the cushion remains green. And again, I like to speculate on why things are happening, and thought perhaps this is just, they don't need the energy anymore for this flower, so they're going to allocate it elsewhere, which and continue to try and you know, be active in terms of photosynthesizing elsewhere, which is pretty cool if that's the case. And this is the last one, but again, similar kind of to what I've shown you in the last couple, but this Labrador tea was kind of protecting this patch of green. It was kind of lying down over it. And you can see that this is much greener and still has maintained chlorophyll, whereas the more exposed areas have reverted to their fall-winter kind of heat absorption mode. So I thought that was also very interesting. All right. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate the patience. I know there was a lot of wild graphs and stuff, but I hope you did enjoy. And a big thank you to Carissa and my field assistants who helped me with this project. And this lovely piece of art was done by a local gal named N.L. And yeah, that's it for me. Any questions would be gladly taken.
This is John Maunder here. I've got a couple of questions, but I'll ask you one that you started off with earlier in the talk. The fact that in Newfoundland, at least on the Avalon, we seem to have we'll say May blooming versus July blooming, and you've mentioned also something in October, but maybe that's just an extension of the July flowering form. Now, one thing that I've noticed, you've probably noticed it as well, is that the plants that bloom in July and August are different plants from the plants that bloom in May and June. They're not the same plants at all, which makes me ask, well, are there actually two, we'll say, genetic forms below subspecies involved that you know, have different timing because they're different? And one of the things I've wondered about, and it's not based on anything more than speculation, I suppose, really, is that well, you know, how come that, say, in the Goldilocks zone, as you call it, on the Avalon, these two are growing together in one place? Now, do you have any idea of the blooming dates of diapensia outside the Hawk Hills, you know, up into northern areas and down into Vermont and all that stuff, and in the Arctic? Like, are the blooming in May and June ones maybe southern, and the ones that bloom in August further north? That would be the first part of the question. And
Right.
so have you any sense of the distribution of the early and late bloomers?
That's a great and very interesting question. I don't know specifically, but from kind of the research that I was doing in kind of communicating with different folks, it seemed to me that both in the Arctic region, so in the north, and in alpine regions to the south, although I did struggle a bit to find some data and information there, but although I'm sure that it exists, that they were June blooming, or like early, like spring, June blooming. But again, I feel like I don't know for sure. But from what I had read, they were June blooming.
In the south.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In the
Because
south, yeah.
because here's a wild and crazy hypothesis you might like to think about. You know, these things are pretty tough, and you know, if you think back to the last glaciations and what was going on then, suppose I say to you that maybe the June blooming ones were from stock that, you know, during the glaciations maybe bloomed in the southern Appalachian or whatever when things were pushed south, and maybe the August ones were from the high Arctic, and in fact were late blooming because they're from the high Arctic. It may have taken them kind of longer to get their act together to bloom during the year, and supposing then after the ice melted, the northern ones sort of filled in from the north and the southern ones filled in from the south, and lo and behold, they kind of met, say, on the Avalon Peninsula and similar places in Newfoundland, and therefore there's a early and a late together, whereas maybe they came from two different directions, having been split, and maybe there's some genetic difference there. And I guess one possibility would be maybe to see if there's a genetic difference between the early and late bloomers. That's it's something that, to me, it may not be true at all, but it seems like it could be. So
I think it's a great collaboration to have with Julia Saronkel in biology, because she's really a like phylogenetic biogeographer. That's So
true,
I think that's it.
But if in fact there's something going on and there's a genetic difference, then maybe you almost have to have, on the Hawk Hills or similar places, two parallel studies, one of the early and one of the late ones, because there may be lots of things that are different.
It's possible. And I've heard, or I believe it was in the Day and Scott papers, that their speculation was relating to the, let's say, more favorable, which when you're talking about the weather in Newfoundland, sometimes that word isn't necessarily used to describe it, but because it's like the fall is a bit more warm, like there's a more extended period of time where it might be more favorable, whereas when you're looking at kind of the alpine areas that it grows to the south, so like you're mentioning, like Appalachia, and also the Arctic areas, they're kind of a bit more maybe limited in terms of their favorability of the environment. So that was, I believe, their kind of speculation on why there was two separate. But how long before that becomes a genetic difference, I suppose, like in terms of evolution, I guess.
But I mean, the glaciations didn't just happen sort of in one wave, you know. It could happen over a long while. Okay, I don't want to hog the stage here, but while I got you, just one more quick question. I noticed your picture of the larch sort of protecting one of the little clumps and causing it to look different, and even the Labrador tea sitting next to a green splotch on the thing. Are you aware of any mycorrhizal fungal associations in these things? Because boys, that can make a big difference to almost everything, and especially living in harsh areas, it might be a factor. I just to throw that out, and then I'll be quiet.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point. Also something that I hadn't thought about, but as you can kind of see, if I can go back to Carissa's kind of So this one here, you can see like how developed the root system kind of is. So it is quite possible that there is some interactions there. I'm not aware of them, but
I was thinking of the diapensia gaining we'll say nutrients from the larch or from the Labrador tea, that sort of thing, sort of like an association of cooperative association between the different.
Well, it
Anyway.
could even just be happy circumstance that because the larch is there with its mycorrhizal associations, there's just more kind of nutrients in the soil from breakdown of those mycorrhizal over time, breakdown of larch material over time. So it might just be a slightly, I mean, we're talking about a real harsh scale here. So even being slightly a little bit nicer might give it that relief that lets it loosen that tight cushion or
Well, yeah, but I mean, it's worth looking at probably. And the last observation is that diapensia's got really long taproots. I dug one up once, it was over 5 feet long, and so who knows where their roots are going. But anyway, I'll stop.
thanks.
I would just want to ask 2 questions. One, well, the first one might sound a bit stupid, but if our winds seem to be, and they're getting harsher and stronger, the border plants like the bog rosemary and the Labrador tea, to me, they'd be more threatened as opposed to the diapensia, which is tucked in the crevices low to the ground. Like, is that a possibility that they're actually more secure if winds pick up and get higher and higher? Like, they wouldn't be as endangered. It's just I've just thought about it when you were talking about the plants. And the other question, we usually go to the Hawk Hills, but I don't remember myself going to the wilderness area that you go in. And I was just wondering how you access it and how could we access it for a day trip?
Easily.
No. So I get Carissa, did you want to speak on the first question first, and then
Yeah.
So I think all of those species that you talk about that are kind of bog barrens plants are quite hardy to these harsh conditions. I mean, they're ubiquitous across the subarctic. So I think although, there'd be some frost burn or snow scouring on the edge of one side, on the windward side, that I think that we even, we see them out on Torbay Point being like blasted with salt spray. So I think that they'll be all right up there. But Heather can tell you about the trials and tribulations of getting into the Avalon Wilderness Reserve.
So I entered the reserve on Horse Chops Road, so just near Cape Royal. And the road is pretty fine up until you get basically close to the reserve, but then it turns into it's no longer maintained because there's no more cabins, or if there are, people will take in pretty beat up trucks, or in my case a field truck. And I don't believe, because it's a wilderness reserve, I should know this, but I believe that ATV use, like you can't leave the trail or anything using ATVs, and I'm not even sure if you can actually use ATVs within the reserve 100%. I think that might be kind of dependent on the reserve with wilderness reserves. Yeah. So, and there was a lot of, because you're kind of going through a lot of changes in, you're going like uplands where you have large ponds or largish ponds that have flooded over the road. And so that's a challenge to get through.
So you're still driving in a truck?
I was, yeah.
And you eventually get out and walk a bit, or you just go in as far as you need to go in the truck?
I went in as far as I needed to go in the truck, and then I just walked. It was kind of a bit of a, at the beginning, it was a bit of a recon mission, because going into the Avalon Wilderness Reserve, I had, based on the geology and the topography, I was fairly certain that I was going to find them there, but there wasn't really any large amount of detail in any literature that I could find about it. But I wanted to try. And so there was kind of a recon mission to just kind of find them in the first place. So I have a couple points, but the road deteriorates faster and faster as you kind of like go in. So my sites actually aren't that far in on the road, although it feels like a lifetime because you have to drive, 50.
And just Heather described this to me because I didn't go to the Avalon Wilderness Reserve sites, that it's not like the Hawk Hills that you have these big stretches of the Barrens. It's just really isolated patches. And then otherwise it's kind of your regular heathland or slightly boggy areas you would expect. So it's not such a distinct landscape feature.
Yeah. It's not quite as expansive, I guess would be the right word. Yeah.
So would you do this in a day trip?
I think that depending on how long you are planning to be out there, like doing kind of tours or whatever, especially in the fall, which is when I did a lot of my field work, you're pretty limited to about a 3-hour period of, like, it took me probably 2 hours-ish to get out there, 2 and a bit maybe. And then I had like 3 hours to do my field work and get out of there before it was dark, basically. So like 3 to 4 hours. In the summer, obviously, you'd have a bit more time, and you would run into issues with water, probably, but obviously, kind of.
And longer for us because we'd have to find the plants.
Yeah,
you know where they're to now, right?
Yes, I do. So I mean, I could.
Thanks, Heather.
Yeah, no worries.
John here. I just make a comment. I'm not 100% sure, but I think if you're trying to take a group into a wilderness area, you got to get a permit.
Good to know.
I should add that we did have all our permits. We had permits.
Well, Karen here. I want to say how lucky we are to have the Hawk Hills so close to St. John's and so accessible. I think we've been able to go up almost every year, at least once. And I certainly appreciate learning about how the diapensia are cushioning other plants, because when I go to take pictures, I usually would try to find just the perfect diapensia all by itself. And now I'll appreciate what is happening. It's lovely how they're sharing the warmth and protecting one another. Yeah. So thank you. I learned a lot tonight. I appreciate that. Yeah.
Well, thank you again for inviting us. It was fun. I mean, Heather and I are just absolute tiny little Barrens plants nerds. So we were very happy to be able to talk about it again.
Yeah. Well, I have a thank you too in the chat from Ann Madden for an excellent presentation. And I agree, it certainly was wonderful to to learn something. Can't wait to go back to the Hawk Hills. I guess we'll have to. But yeah, it sounds great. Great to be there and to learn more about it.
Well, thank you both.
Okay.
It was a great presentation.
Awesome. That's good. And Roger, just to answer your question about fish habitat quickly. I think what I've learned from this is that you kind of have to look at all aspects of a habitat to get an idea of what's on the go. So that's how I look at, even though I'm a plant gal, I draw on those, making sure to look at all the details of what's going on in the habitat so I can make comments or, yeah.
Great lesson.
Yeah.
Hi, this is Claudia here. Thank you for the presentation, and I apologize because I have been approached for data, and somehow that never happened. It was something in the data sharing agreement writing process that went awry, and apparently the provincial government and Memorial don't deal very well with each other.
And it was a
that was
pandemic.
just one thing I wanted to say, but I was very curious about the site that you had data from the Northern Peninsula, and how, in terms of its plant community composition, it ended up being a lot more like Baffin Island than anything on the east coast of Newfoundland versus Vermont, and all of those. They seem to sort of overlap a heck of a lot more with each other. That like it's sort of almost like a dividing line went through the middle of Newfoundland, where I was wondering, and I'm assuming that it was not on limestone because it doesn't seem to like that very much.
No, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, where exactly was that Newfoundland, that Northern Peninsula site? I'm curious.
So that was Carissa, this was Anna's. So a fellow lab mate did their field work for their master's in gaff topsoil, and I'm not sure, Carissa, you can.
No, I'm trying to remember too. So Anna Crofts did tree line range expansion masters on the slopes around Kings Point, but then we wanted to kind of look for alpine areas where trees we could identify like happy microsites for tree range expansion. And so she collected this community composition data set, and when Heather was doing her master's, that's when we were in the toughest lockdown. Like, we must have filled out 20 forms for Heather to be able to drive to the Hawk Hills. I'm not joking. We had like a Heather will hand sanitize when she touches the steering wheel. Heather will hand sanitize when she opens the car door. And so we had to come up with strategies to get data that didn't involve field work. And it kind of, this little light bulb went off that Anna's data set, Anna Croft's data set, was existing. And she really, honestly, she hiked all over the lower part of the Great Northern Peninsula and across kind of around Kings Point. So that like western part of central Newfoundland and into the lower area of the Northern Pen. And she visited just a ton of sites, but Claudia, we can send you those locations for sure. And don't worry about the data sharing thing. I know it's a pain, and it was the pandemic, and we were so overrun with everything at the time. So don't worry.
But yeah, just to speak quickly on like because we were dealing with data that was kind of all over the place and a bit like, or not all over the place, but varying sample sizes, because I was just trying to get what I could. It's possible that was slightly skewed. So it may look like the Northern Peninsula is like right within the sites that I got from the Canadian Museum of Nature herbarium data from Nunavut, but they did have some similar species like betula and different alder and stuff like that. But there was also some species that were more similar to the Avalon as well. It's just possible that in trying to visualize the data, it kind of just got kind of skewed, I guess. Hopefully that answers your question. But yeah.
Okay, kind of, sort of. Well, thank you. And it sort of seems that both geographically and ecologically, it may not have been as far away from the Hawk Hills site as it appeared to be.
Yeah.
Heather, I wanted to ask you.
That's cool, because I mean, there's a lot of high elevation ground in Western Newfoundland that could be full of diapensia for all we know, where there's just not enough people spending enough time up there to really look for it. And who knows what might turn up of the June versus August flowering and all of this.
Yeah. Cool.
Heather, I just wanted to ask you, getting back to the wilderness area, how prevalent, I know it's a big area if I haven't walked it, but how prevalent is it to see the diapensia? Like, could you be there a whole day and not see any?
Yep, I would, for sure. So if this gives you any idea, so there's not many side roads off of this main kind of trail. So I basically stuck to that. And I would come across one barren area where I thought, based on like previous experiences in the Hawk Hills and kind of just other locations that I've seen in literature and just its general habitat preferences, that it would be there, and it wasn't. But then maybe half a kilometer down the road, there would be another barren area and it would be there. So that was something that was really interesting, because I guess maybe I wanted to know why that was happening, but that's a whole other thing. But yeah, so I think that also a lot of the Avalon Wilderness Reserve, because it is so large and because a large portion of it is the Avalon Forest, or like more bog and kind of black spruce forest / some larch and balsam, but like it may get less and less likely. There were a couple of sites that I couldn't get to that I could see from my high points where I was working, that probably, if you could magically get there, they probably could possibly be there, but one, you would need a boat, or the other one was way, I don't even know how you would get there. But it was like probably the highest point in the Avalon Wilderness Reserve. And yeah, I believe there's the name of it, I can't recall, but it's one of the highest points in there. Yeah.
Thanks, Heather.
No worries.
Another quick one. Have you noticed the diapensia associated with moss campions? What used to be called Silene collis is now different, but that's what it used to be. Because down at Cape St. Mary is a couple hundred feet from the visitor center. There's diapensia, and it's growing with moss campion and other things.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. So in Hawk Hills, and less so, I would say, in Avalon Wilderness Reserve, but it grew quite often or frequently with alpine azalea, which is kind of pretty cushion forming, but I never saw it with moss campion, but I know that like perhaps on the west coast of the island, because I believe that might be more frequent there as well. It's possible that it does. but I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah, it's Cape St. Mary's right on top of the cliffs there, about
Interesting.
400 feet up. It's not much of it. It's just a little patch of it. It's not far from the visitor center.
Hmm.
There's a bunch of other alpine things in the same patch.
Cool.
Heather, I was just going to mention that recently, I think just the last week, I had seen an article about scientists using drones to look for plants in Hawaii on the islands that they thought had been extinct. And they found this a wonderful way to go looking. And they've actually figured out a way to take specimens if they needed or wanted to. So maybe next time you go to the wilderness area, you could take some drones with you.
That would be
We
a good.
joke, but we do have a lab drone, so it's
Okay, perfect.
not, I don't know if either of us should fly it though.
No, well,
In those
have to
winds.
take lessons.
I just feel like flying in those winds just seems like
Yes, of course.
asking for trouble.
You need a perfect day. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we should clue up and say this has been just a wonderful presentation for both of you, Carissa and Heather, and we thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank
very
you.
much.
Thank you.
Okay. Hope to see everybody back in January when we have our slideshow. It's always
Hopefully.
fun.
Hopefully.
Yes, hopefully.
Bye. Thank you.
Yeah, we have a little gift
Okay.
coming your way.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, Karen.
Yes, you're
Yep.
welcome. Yeah.